speaker this evening. Dr. John Hannaford came to Ball State in 1950. Since then, he has been quite active in community and university affairs. He received his A.B. degree from Wabash College in Indiana, and then both his master's and Ph.D. from Harvard University. Head of the Department of Economics, he will speak tonight on the Negro in the city. My pleasure, Dr. Hannaford.
Mr. Brown's story this evening about the sun and the moon reminded me of a parallel one I once heard regarding two gentlemen discussing which were the most important, the sun or the moon. And after some discussion, one of them took the firm position that the moon was the more important. And the other one wanted to know why on earth why, and he said, because it shines at night when you need it so badly. And that's all there is to it. The subject of the Negro in the city is such a complex thing that is like one huge ball of yarn. If you tug on it at any place, it affects all the rest of it. And I decided to tug on the economics corner of it, as some of you might guess. I, as a matter of fact, narrowed it down still further, and I'm going to speak on a particular aspect of the economic problem of the Negro in the city, having to do with ghetto housing, because I believe an understanding of the nature and origins of ghetto housing and how our society generates it will give us a longer step in understanding the position of the Negro in the city than any other thing I can say. So beware, I'm going to speak to you in economics, as Pogo said. Economics is common sense made difficult, and an economist is someone who can take difficult material and make it incomprehensible. And just in case someone should understand what I might say, I have written it out, and following my remarks, we will have a film for about 15 minutes. I would invite you to be particularly aware of the architectural building aspects of the ghetto as it comes out in the film we're going to see, because that is what my remarks are about. A house has a birth, a life, and a death. And as it moves from construction to demolition, its value declines. The time between may be long or short, depending on the original quality of the house and upon its maintenance. But the events of construction and destruction are as inevitable as they are for all things. For houses, the natural end usually comes between 45 and 75 years, although a few Methuselahs hang on much longer. Cities are born as villages, and towns, and when they are born, they're made up of houses all clustered around a central crossroads that is called downtown or something like this. While this circle of houses in a new village tends to be all of about the same age, they are not all of the same quality. Some of the houses are built for low-income laborers and poor. Some are the houses for the village merchants, bankers, and fledgling industrialists. A buyer of a fine house wants it beside and among other fine houses, and will seldom purchase unless it is. Now, builders know this, and they lump houses of similar quality together in one quadrant of a developing village. In another part of the circle of houses of the new hamlet are houses of lower value, and other parts, section by section, have built in them residences of lower and lower qualities and sizes. Now, all of them, the sections of mansions and the sections of mean houses, enter into a decline in value associated with age. And as the age of the town grows, because our nation is growing and because we are becoming more and more urban, as the town grows, a new circle of newer houses goes up around the older circle. The significant thing about the new circle of housing is that it will contain fewer of the lower quality of homes than the first one. Why should this be so? The reason is that some of the houses in the first circle have deteriorated in value till they have become equal to the cheapest of the new circle. So a larger fraction of the housing adjacent to the downtown has slid off in value by reason of age till they are economically eligible for purchase or rental by the very lowest income groups of the town. The march of a decade or two will lay another circle of housing down around the town, and again this circle of residences does not contain as many houses of the lowest incomes as even the second circle, let alone the first. The low-income segment of the enlarged population of the growing town find more of the first houses built have been eroded by time to the lowest purchase prices and rentals appropriate and economically necessary for the very poor people. And so the hamlet grows to village, to town, to city, to megapolis by concentric circles. But every new circle laid down tends to have a smaller fraction of housing for the lowest or lower income groups because a larger and larger fraction of the first rings of housing put up is reduced to a value where the poor can occupy it. What in the long run, what is the long-term fate of the first houses built in a big city when it was a village or a town? The commercial core of the city will expand in its need for land and elbow over the old houses to replace them with department stores, hotels, restaurants, and other downtown enterprises. The entire first circle of housing may be soaked up by such enterprises, and then what? The commercial core cannot move outward forever. That simply is an economic impossibility. What does happen is that a wider and wider band of housing around the center core falls over the precipice of time until its age makes it of a value marketable only to the very poor. The poor come. In recent years, they've been coming in a tide. It may be that the poor will come from the cotton field and the southern village shanty in such numbers that they will fill to the bursting point this aged housing at first. But the poor cannot indefinitely continue, decade after decade, to fill up the ever-expanding circle of old housing. Each new poor person in town can afford only a few square feet of even the cheapest housing. Rents per capita may go down, but rents per building are likely to go up because of the number of people in each house. Such concentrations of people increase the wear and tear on the already worn and torn houses. The heavy demand may cause rents to be bid upward as far as a house goes, even as the condition of the building goes downward. The owners see the final physical collapse of their buildings in sight, see the total dilapidation and inevitable abandonment of their properties coming. They stop maintenance expenditures and they deposit in the bank the high rental income as long as an income can be wrung from the ever more dilapidated wrecks. The Negro tenants know quite certainly that they are paying more rent per room than is paid in the next ring of white housing farther out. The most human reaction imaginable is for the renting family to show their displeasure by a disrespect for the property that is a rebellion against the cold profit maximization of the landlord, who will not maintain it. It is in its most pronounced form, the renters may riot and set the torch to the housing they hate. Bad housing grows worse rapidly, at the very least, through such a mutual, natural conflict between owner and renter. In the meantime, the immediately adjacent ring of housing has been losing value because of the swift deterioration of the neighboring residences. Value and rentals start falling there to a level that invites the Negro and the poor to move block by block into a new concentric circle of better housing. This reduces the population pressure in the inner circle, and some of the most dilapidated houses stand vacant. The vacant building will be vandalized. The abandoned and vandalized building, burnt out and standing as a shelter for vagrants and vermin, is a prominent feature of ghettos at this stage of their evolution. But what does the ghetto evolve into from there? The remarkable fact is that within the framework of the market, there is no place for the ghetto to go from there. Who will build or rebuild in such a place with the whole wide world as his alternative site? No man, black or white, with the money and inclination to build a home for himself, is likely to put it in an environment so repelling. No businessman looking for maximum return on his investment will put a dollar there as far as new housing or major remodeling of old housing goes. A factor determining the density of concentration in the ghetto is the enforcement of sanitation, fire, building, and zoning codes. An eager and tight enforcement will cause buildings to be abandoned sooner, particularly if such stringent enforcement is introduced suddenly after years of laxity. The cost to the slumlord of upgrading the condition of his housing is so great that he will let it fall into disuse rather than undertake a series of relatively heavy expenditures. If the cost of meeting minimal expenses is to be made economically attractive, rents must be raised, and his clients, caught in the crush of poverty, probably will move elsewhere rather than pay a higher price for housing. The price of the housing per person, not its quality, is controlling for very poor people. If building code enforcement causes owners to raise rents, the zoning codes requiring a single family per residence or some other fixed number per structure may be grossly violated, as the immigrants to the city double up and then redouble again. This covert practice permits the slumlord to collect the higher gross income per house, and his occupants pay a lower rent per person. But if code enforcement authorities force the owner to turn out the extra occupants, the family left cannot and will not pay the landlord his previous gross. The deteriorated condition of the property is let slide, and the abandonment again becomes its natural future. Basically, the forces of demand deriving from the poor occupants is too weak to finance the economic rebuilding or even maintenance of the old Central City housing. So the march of time carries Central City housing from simple deterioration to utter dilapidation. The concentration of children and adults and their disrespect for the structural wrecks in which they live is such that deterioration, dilapidation, and abandonment are accelerated. So once an area slips onto the grease slide of ghettoization, its owners know that whatever return they are to wring from it must be gotten soon. Therefore, rentals are set to return the low market value in 3 or 4 years instead of the 10 or 11 years, which is the norm for housing in higher income areas. When the 3 or 4 years are up, any expenditure on the property is thought of as throwing away good money into the hopeless future of the property. And we have one interview in the film coming up that shows just this point, the stubborn refusal of a landlord to maintain his property because that's not the way to maximize profit. Borrowed money is the lifeblood of any real estate market, to a larger extent than in other markets. But slum neighborhoods have no such lifeblood. Slum neighborhoods are on the blacklist of financial institutions. Any bank, savings and loan association, or insurance company that lends with real estate as security can turn a minimum profit and stay in business only if it lends against property in so-called stable neighborhoods. That is, the real estate must have a reasonably secure future value for the 15 or 20 years that real estate loans normally run. It is quite clear that a secure value in the future is the one thing that ghetto or near ghetto real estate does not have. Therefore, the normal borrowing and lending markets that undergird American housing in general are denied to ghetto housing. The credit that one finds in the ghetto housing market is bizarre. Bizarre in its methods, bizarre in its rates of interest, and in its time periods. Loans are seldom for more than 3 or 4 years, and the effective rates of interest range from 25% to well above 50%. What rational buyer could possibly want to acquire ghetto properties at such penalties? With the march of time, the ghetto properties start passing out of use by even the poorest. The property has been used up and more than used up by the very poor while the owner got all the money possible from it. The property has now expired as a human habitat. Even the very site is dead because no one wants to build there. This economic vacuum has been filled by federal urban renewal programs of various kinds in recent years. The effect of federal housing projects on the general condition of the total slum has been dubious. The government purchase price of the land to be cleared for a housing project is fair to the point of generous. The price paid has little relation to the maintenance expenditures in recent years. Therefore, An announcement by a city that it is going to seek a federally assisted program of slum clearance causes all landlords in even the potential target areas to tend to forego even their customary meager maintenance as they wait for the government to buy them out, and this may be years and years later at the attractive prices the government pays. Furthermore, when the new federal projects start operations, they tend to admit only the desirable families and to leave the private housing to the abusive and destructive renters the federal project managers will not have. As the quality of a ghetto house deteriorates from the fell hand of time and the lack of maintenance, the difficulty of keeping a renter of some kind in it, even a high-risk renter, becomes greater and greater as it sinks towards its doom. The coup de grace of a property is vandalism, while a house or apartment is temporarily vacant. Fixtures of all kinds are ripped out to be sold as junk. It is then totally unrentable to anyone, and adjacent houses lose their renters. Owner-occupied places nearby may seek to flee unless the owners are very old and just can't move. These additional newly vacated properties now become the object of thieves and vandals. The blighting pox of wreckage and boarded-up windows spreads. And as you see the ghetto pictures, notice how many of the buildings are boarded up and abandoned. Remodeling or major rehabilitation of rundown buildings has grown more expensive relative to the cost of new building. When a house reaches the age where its afflictions cannot be cured by the normal maintenance of paint, of roofing, and patching plaster, the economical move is to replace it entirely. But who builds a new house in the midst of a ghetto when the same house costs no more among other new houses in suburbia? Better try to sell it for whatever can be gotten, if anything can, or just let it stand. Small sophistication is required by anyone who has lived in America in recent years to believe that the cost of vandalism and fire insurance in the ghetto regions is prohibitive. The high insurance rates raise rentals and cause more doubling up, or more likely, the owner carries no insurance and expects to abandon the property when violence or misfortune falls upon it. Now, what is the moral stripe and personal nature of the few investors who are dealers in such a housing market? Perhaps half the properties are owned by the big slumlords, and these owners specialize in the absentee ownership of slum properties. That is their business. Such specialists are in easy command of all the good market reasons outlined above as to why the ghetto had to become a ghetto and must remain a ghetto. Business is business. The effect on the merchandisers of housing is that the professional, ethical, modern, progressive dealer in real estate avoids doing business in the ghetto. The absentee landlord is among the hereditary traditional objects of invective and hostility in our culture. When he is not only an absentee, but is a slumlord as well, the attitudes of the poor toward the house in which they live and toward all the houses around it is often one of veiled hostility leading to vandalism or worse. To live in a rodent and vermin-infested tumbling-down refugee from the wrecker's ball, and to discover that the affluent owner living in the suburbs will scarcely turn a dollar to its improvement breeds aggression, however good the owner's economic reasons for what he is doing. So the ghetto real estate owner has tenants who turn into the kind of tenants that he probably deserves. Not only do such slumlords operate in a market that is weak and flabby, now and then and here and there, the local real estate of the ghetto has a market that turns absolutely perverse in the classical sense. One of the necessary assumptions of a stable market is that buyers will want to pay more, that buyers will want to buy more at lower prices, and that sellers will want to sell less. A further necessary assumption is that a change in price upward or downward will not be interpreted to be the prelude to a further change in price by buyers and sellers. Now, this is just the interpretation, however, that is placed on a weakening of real estate prices as a residential area moves into the market quicksand that sucks it down into the ghetto. That is, price falls, and sellers believe that it is a prelude to a further fall in price
so they all want to sell before price does fall further. Buyers, on the other hand, believe a further fall in price is coming, so they buy less rather than more as a result of the fall in price. Sellers are all about, but there are no buyers. The best the potential sellers can do is hang on and hope that an urban renewal project, or for a foolish, ill-informed buyer whom they can hoodwink into taking the property off their hands. Thus, the ghetto housing market deals in properties that are so old that they need a really major remodeling or replacement, that cannot be used for securities to purchase or rebuild them, that are inhabited by tenants bent on evening the score with the absentee landlord and with the establishment generally, that are insurable only at prohibitive rates. In short, the market is the housing junkyard of the city. Borrowing money to remodel slum housing is a problem, but the solution to the problem is rewarded with a penalty, a property tax increase. The power to tax is the power to kill, and a near mortal wound to property is indicated if all the income of a government is derived from a tax on real property, particularly if those who pay are the poor. If all taxes were levied on any good, say clothing, we would expect the clothing of the public to be meager and to be in tatters. The result of taxing the housing of the poor and, relatively, not taxing other goods tends to result in only the most minimal ghetto-type housing for the poor. The per capita value of the housing real estate in the slums is often in the vicinity of $500. Even a 10% rate of taxation could thus collect only $50 per person. Well-financed school systems collect that much per capita for their education alone. Raising the taxes to pay for more badly needed government services has the effect of raising rents and causing families to pile up more tightly. And taxable improvements are discouraged if the rents cannot be raised. Again, poverty keeps the poor poor. And economically as well as sociologically, slums are their own causation. No burden of being poor, and being poor in the city bears down more heavily on the self-respect of the ghetto resident than the advertisement to the world announced by the place where he lives. It is eloquent to him because he knows it is eloquent to the society. The physical image of slumdom is its housing. What can be done to change it? A revolutionary rewriting of our zoning laws that would scatter low-income housing broadly into a heterogeneous mixture of our classes is so idealistic, so unrealistic, that one must reject it as visionary. I'm thinking of such a situation as taking our lots that are in the areas that have $30,000 and $40,000 houses. These are large lots, cutting them up into small lots, so people who pay $8,000 or $10,000 for a home can afford to build there. Of course, the person living in the $40,000 house is going to have 3 little houses beside him, and they're going to have junk cars in the front yard. His children are going to walk with their children to school. We're going to have an amelioration of the racial question in America, but I say we're not going to do it. Such a solution would threaten the property values and the sense of social propriety beyond the threshold of sacrifice of the American middle class, beyond the moral commitment to equality of our society. One alternative, bold but not too bold, involves the city acquisition of the central city land rather than leaving it floating in an economic vacuum. When the city acquires the property, probably under the federal urban redevelopment program, what is the most imaginative and socially productive thing they could do with the land? The city should accumulate it, landscape it, and hold it as parkland, while they wait for the market system to speak with a clear voice regarding its future use. And when the land is put to private use, when the economic call is clear, it should be leased, not sold. Let it be leased at long term. Such leases in due course would supply the municipality a dependable and businesslike revenue
far exceeding property taxes. The unearned increment on land site values has now had 3/4 of a century of acceptance among economists since Henry George first overemphasized its benefits. The bedeviled society that now is embarrassed and frustrated by its inability to control the land use of its core cities would never again have to fear that mortification. The basis would be laid for only carefully selected and defined uses of the land. The land use would come up for renewal on a staggered time basis that would keep the city in command of the overall use of its land. Some cities would bring a small amount of land under such control, and some a larger amount. Whatever the amount, it would be a net gain for the long-run amelioration of the central city ghetto. Now I'd like for you to give your attention to a 15-minute film that was selected because of its content focusing upon the buildings and the architecture and their condition as an example of a ghetto. Thank you.